Around the year 1440, an English gardener wrote his trade into verse. His name has come down to us as Jon Gardener, and his poem is the oldest gardening manual in the English language. The garden he describes ran on no money at all. Nothing was bought, and nothing that could rot, burn, or be woven was ever thrown away. His methods fed households that could never afford a failed season. American gardeners now spend north of $40 billion a year, and plenty of those gardens still fail by July. Somewhere between his world and ours, we drop the entire toolkit. 15 methods built gardens like his. One of them would later ripen pineapples in an English winter, using nothing but a farmyard waste product. Tonight we rebuild that garden, all 15 methods, in the order a family would have built it. The living wall first, then the soil, then the planting, then the tricks against the calendar, and last the harvest that had to keep until spring. Start with the ground. A patch behind a cottage, a quarter acre or less, expected to feed a family every year without fail. There was no backup plan behind it. If the garden had a bad year, the family had a bad year, and everyone in the household knew it. The tools for that job were common knowledge for so long that nobody thought they needed writing down, which is exactly why Jon Gardener's poem is so rare. He recorded what every village already knew, what herbs to set and when, how to graft, how to grow saffron, because he assumed someone would always need it. Then, inside roughly 2 lifetimes of cheap fertilizer and cheap food, the whole toolkit went from ordinary to forgotten. So we are going to pick it back up piece by piece. Method 1 is the wall, and the wall is alive. A plot this valuable had enemies: deer, pigs, a neighbour's cattle, and hungrier neighbours. A dead fence of cut wood answers all of them for a while, but a dead fence starts rotting the day you drive the first post. Medieval plots were guarded instead by a laid hedge. You plant a row of hawthorn or blackthorn, let it grow a few years, then cut each young trunk most of the way through at the base, bend it sideways, and weave it between stakes. The tree survives the cut. Hedgers call those half-cut living stems pleachers, and a pleacher heels bent over, throws new shoots straight up, and knits into a barrier a bull will not push through. Left alone, it grows thicker and stronger every single year, and it feeds birds and bees while it stands guard. Done properly, the same hedge can be relaid every generation or so, and simply never stop working. There are hedges in Britain that have been doing this job, on the same line in the ground, for many hundreds of years. England still runs on the leftovers of this method, and it has lost something close to half of its hedgerows since the Second World War. That is how recently this knowledge was still ordinary. A laid hedge needs stakes, though, and beans need poles, and every fence and basket needs rods. There was no lumber yard to buy them from. That problem had its own answer, and it is method 2. The coppice. Cut a hazel or a willow down to a stump and it refuses to die. It throws up a ring of straight new shoots, and in roughly 7 years those shoots are poles. Cut them, and the stump simply does it again. A single managed coppice produced fencing, bean poles, tool handles, and firewood on an endless loop, and some English coppice stumps have been cycling like that for hundreds of years and are still alive. The medieval garden did not buy its infrastructure, it grew its infrastructure. Rods from the coppice were woven into wattle, and wattle explains what these gardens actually looked like. Around the year 820, a plan was drawn for an ideal monastery at St. Gall in what is now Switzerland, and its kitchen garden is laid out as 18 neat rectangular beds. Raised beds, edged and contained, each with its own crop. That is method 3, and it is quietly brilliant. The beds were kept narrow for a simple reason. A gardener kneeling on the path had to reach the middle without ever putting a boot on the soil. Raise the soil and it drains in a wet year, warms earlier in spring, and never gets walked on, so it never packs down. The paths take the boots. The beds stay soft enough to work with bare hands year after year without ever being dug hard again. Modern no-dig gardeners are rediscovering this layout bed by bed, usually with timber kits that cost real money. A medieval family got the same result with mud and sticks from Method 2. An edged bed full of loose soil is still just a box of dirt. The garden's engine was what went into it, and what went into it was everything. Kitchen scraps, crop waste, animal bedding, ash from the floor, and above all, manure. Method 4 is the dung heap, and muck was treated like money because it was money. Manorial records track it, and gardeners banked, turned, and guarded the household heap like a savings account. The heap was built in layers, wet green waste against dry straw, and turned over with a fork every few weeks to keep it breathing. Pile that material up, and something strange happens inside. Within days, the core of a fresh heap runs hot enough that you cannot hold your hand in it, hot enough to steam on a frozen morning. For now, that heat is just a sign the heap is working, breaking everything down into black living soil. But keep that heat in mind. It comes back near the middle of this list as the strangest method medieval Europe ever handed forward. Pay attention to Method 5 because it explains a law that sounds invented. The strongest fertilizer in the medieval world was pigeon dung, several times richer in nitrogen than farmyard manure, and gardeners prized it for onions, leeks, and anything that fed hard. That is why manors and monasteries built dovecotes, round towers lined inside with hundreds of nesting holes, whose pigeons flew out every day, fed themselves on the countryside, and flew home every night to deposit fertilizer in one convenient pile. A large dovecote could house several hundred breeding pairs, which meant meat for the Lord's table in winter and sack after sack of concentrated fertilizer all year round. Here is the catch. In much of medieval Europe, keeping a dovecote was a lord's privilege. The birds fed freely on the peasants' grain, and the peasants were forbidden to harm them. If you are wondering how that could possibly be legal, so did centuries of very angry farmers. In France, resentment of the dovecote lasted right up until the Revolution. Dung and droppings covered the rich side of soil feeding. The mineral side came from the fire and from under the ground, and it is Method 6. Wood ash from the hearth went onto the beds, returning the potash that plants pull out of soil. Soot went on too, and crushed shells wherever there were shells to crush. For sour, heavy ground there was marl, a lime-rich clay dug out of pits and spread to sweeten acidic soil. 13th century farming manuals recommend it, and old marl pits still dimple the English countryside by the thousand. Nothing on that list was purchased. The household burned wood anyway, cooked anyway, dug anyway. The garden was simply plumbed into every waste stream the family produced. With the soil fed, the planting itself breaks every rule a modern seed packet teaches, and that is Method 7. A medieval bed was crowded on purpose. Cabbages, leeks, onions, herbs, and pot flowers grew tangled together in the same ground, and the tangle was the point. Strong-smelling plants stood next to tender ones. Tall plants shaded the ones that hated heat, and quick crops came out of the gaps before the slow ones needed the room. Bare soil loses water and grows weeds, so dense mixed planting shaded the ground and choked the weeds out. A bed holding 5 crops confuses pests that hunt by smell, and disease cannot sweep through it the way it sweeps through a field of one thing. And if one crop failed, 4 others were already standing in its place. Row planting, 1 crop to a stretch, is mostly a machine's idea of order. It suits a seed drill and a wheeled hoe. The medieval bed was shaped by a different tool, a person's reach and a person's eyes, every single day. The garden had roughly 30 weeks of growth to cover 52 weeks of eating, and method 8 bent the harvest around that math. The worts that filled the daily pot, the kales, cabbages and leaf beets, were mostly not harvested as whole plants. You picked the outer leaves and left the plant rooted, and it kept throwing new leaves from the centre week after week from March into winter. Pull a cabbage and you eat once. Pick its leaves and you eat all year from the same root. This is the harvest that kept the pottage pot going, the daily stew that sat over almost every peasant fire, fed a handful of leaves at a time. Sowing worked the same way, little and often instead of all at once, so new plants were always rising behind the ones being eaten. The modern glut, 50 zucchini ripening in one August week, is a planning failure a medieval gardener could not afford to make. Method 9 is the one that turned every garden into a breeding program because there was nowhere to buy seed. The best specimens in the bed were deliberately not eaten, which took real discipline in a hungry spring. They were left to stand, flower, and set seed, and that seed was dried, sorted, and kept somewhere safe from damp and mice until sowing time. Which changes what a garden is over time. Save seed from the plants that did best in your soil, your weather, your shade, repeat it for generations, and you end up with a strain of kale or onion adapted to your exact backyard. Farmers call these land races, and seed banks now hunt the last surviving ones as genetic treasure. A medieval family ran that program by default every single year for free. A gardener could have stopped there and eaten well most years. They did not stop there. Method 10 is where the dung heap's heat comes back, and it is the one that sounds like a myth. Take fresh horse manure, stack it into a deep bed, tread it firm, cap it with a layer of fine soil, and the fermenting heap below becomes a radiator that runs for weeks, sometimes months. Sow onto that warm cap in late winter, and seeds germinate as if it were May, while frost sits on the ground beside the frame. Salads in February, cucumbers, and melons weeks ahead of any neighbour, all of it riding on heat that would have been thrown away. Gardeners call it a hotbed, and it turns out the trick is ancient. Roman gardeners used versions of it to keep the Emperor Tiberius supplied with his prescribed daily cucumber out of season nearly 2,000 years ago, and its ceiling is far higher than cucumbers. By the early 1700s, English and Dutch gardeners were using layered hotbeds to ripen pineapples, a tropical fruit in northern Europe, on fermentation heat alone. The furnace was hiding in plain sight on every farm in Europe, free, renewable, and rebuilt fresh every spring. We now burn gas to heat greenhouses for the same job the horse once did. Notice what every method so far has in common. Nothing was bought and nearly everything was made, and that is a spirit you can still act on tonight in your own kitchen. If you would rather make this history with your own hands than just watch it, that is the whole idea behind the Medieval Way store, and it starts with the Medieval Bakery Collection. The Practical Recipes book walks you through real medieval loaves. The Sourdough Manual is for building and keeping a living leaven of your own. And the Sourcing Guide shows you where to find the heritage grain these gardens and fields once grew. Back in the garden, the calendar was about to flip its threat around. By June, the beds were no longer cold. They were dry. Method 11 answered the drought, and it fits in one hand. Medieval gardeners carried a clay vessel called a thumb pot, a jug pierced with small holes in the base and a single hole at the neck. Dunk it in the rain barrel, press your thumb over the neck hole, and the water holds inside by suction. Carry it to the bed, lift your thumb, and it rains gently, exactly where you point it. Museums hold surviving examples, and medieval manuscripts show gardeners walking the beds with them, one hand watering, one hand free. Each plant got a measured drink at the root, where it counts, and nothing was spilled from a supply that had to be hauled by hand. Modern drip irrigation chases the same principle with plastic lines and pumps. The physics already fit in a piece of fired clay 600 years ago. Jon Gardener gave one method a whole section of his poem, and it was not cabbages. Method 12 is grafting. Cut a shoot from an apple tree that bears good fruit, splice it onto the trunk of a young or worthless tree, match the cut edges where the sap runs, bind the joint with bark and clay, and the shoot takes over. The fruit that grows will be the good apple every time. Apples do not come true from seed, so without grafting, every named apple variety on earth would die with its one original tree. With it, a peasant could turn a bitter crabapple into a bearing orchard tree for the cost of a cutting and some skill. Monasteries traded graft wood across Europe, the way libraries traded books, and some apple varieties still grown today have been handed forward, graft by graft, for 500 years. An old orchard is a living archive. The orchard itself did not stand on bare dirt, and that is method 13. Under the trees grew grass, and on the grass grazed geese and sheep, and the stacking was deliberate. The same ground produced 3 harvests at once, fruit overhead, grazing below, and the droppings fell exactly where the trees wanted them. The geese mowed the grass, fattened themselves for the autumn table, and gobbled up the grubs and windfalls that would otherwise carry pests into the next year. Modern agroforestry departments publish papers on silvopasture and measure its yields. The medieval version was just called an orchard, and nobody thought the stacking was clever. It was simply what you did with ground. If the list stopped here, the family would still starve in March, because a garden's real test is not growing food. It is having food in the months when nothing grows. Method 14 is the clamp. Choose a dry spot, pile your roots and cabbages into a mound, jacket the mound in a thick coat of straw, then seal the straw under packed earth, leaving a small straw chimney so it can breathe. Inside, the temperature holds steady, just above freezing, through the whole winter, and the harvest sits in the dark, alive and dormant, until you open one end and dig out what you need. Open it carefully, take what the week requires, and seal it back up against the frost. It runs on 0 energy and needs no building. Farms were still clamping roots this way within living memory, and a root cellar is only this method moved indoors. The refrigerator did not beat the clamp on much, it mostly just shrank it. One worker remains to be hired, and it is method 15. Little of the fruit and few of the beans set without pollinators, so medieval gardeners kept the pollinators on the payroll. Bees lived at the garden's edge in skeps, domes woven from straw or wicker, and they paid twice. Once in pollination for the whole plot, and once in honey, which for most households was the only concentrated sweetener they would ever taste, along with wax for the only clean-burning candles. There is an honest cost to record. Harvesting a skep often meant killing the colony, and the modern hive fixed that, and fixed it well. But a garden with bees in it simply sets more fruit than a garden without. And beekeepers today truck hives to almond orchards and sell that same service by the acre. A medieval family got it for the price of a woven basket. Stand back from the 15 and 1 shape appears, and it is the reason they belong in one video instead of 15. Almost every method is a piece of equipment you grow once and harvest forever. The hedge outlives its planter. The coppice never runs out. The grafted tree bears for a century. The seed line improves itself, and the soil grows richer the longer the system runs. Modern gardening mostly sells us consumables, bagged, shipped, and used up by autumn. The medieval garden was built out of assets, and that is the real thing we forgot. Not any single trick with manure or clay, but the idea that a garden can be capital. Jon Gardener wrote his poem so the knowledge would outlive him. 600 years on, it just did. We dig up the working knowledge history buried. Which method would you actually try? The hedge, the hotbed, or the clamp? Subscribe and keep building. Until next time.